Good afternoon. I see we still have participants joining us, and I'm sure that will happen along the way. My name is Paula Davis, and I serve as the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Diversity for the Schools of the Health Sciences here at the University of Pittsburgh. And I'd like to welcome you to From Reflection to Action, Responding to Racism, the Ultimate Underlying Condition. Our webinar today will be co-hosted by Noble Maseru. And Noble, if you'd like to take a moment and introduce yourself.
Sure. Noble Maseru, Professor, Public Health Practice, Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion, and Center Director, Health Equity at Pitt Public Health.
Terrific, thank you. I'd first like to acknowledge our planning committee who has put an awful lot of work into the event today. So I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Tiffany Gare Webb from the Graduate School of Public Health and Epidemiology, Mario Brown, who is my partner in crime as Director of Health Sciences Diversity, Laura Ann Bray, who coordinates the Center for Health Equity. So thank you to all of your hard work in putting this together today, and hopefully we'll have a pretty enriching webinar for you today. Before we move further, I'd like to let you know who is going to be on our panel today and share their bios. Our first panelist will be Olivia, or Liv Bennett. Liv was raised in Manchester here in the city of Pittsburgh, and she's passionate about improving social equity. Liv is currently a resident of Northview Heights, which is my childhood home, where she has been and continues to be a community activist. Liv graduated magna cum laude from Carlow University in May of 2018 and is currently attending graduate school at the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, where she's studying public policy management. Liv lives with her husband Terrence and her 19-year-old son. She has 3 other children and 3 grandchildren. Liv feels both humbled and honored that the constituents of District 13 elected her to represent them as their county council representative. She also serves as chair of the Public Safety Committee. She is honored to serve them in this role and seeks to represent all of the diverse folks within her district. Our second panelist is a returning son of Pitt Public Health. Dr. Keon Gilbert is Associate Professor at St. Louis University in the Department of Behavioral Science and Health Education at the College for Public Health and Social Justice. As I said, an alumnus of Pitt Public Health, Dr. Gilbert's work draws on his interdisciplinary training in biology, African American studies, public affairs, and public health to investigate the intersection of racial identity, racial socialization, and structural racism as determinants of African American males' health across the life course. Our final panelist, who will be joining us a little bit later, is Dr. Derek Griffith. Dr. Griffith is Professor of Medicine, Health, and Society, and he's founder and director of the Center for Research on Men's Health at Vanderbilt University. Trained in psychology and public health, Dr. Griffith has collaborated with colleagues in Canada, Ireland, New Zealand, and the United States to promote health and well-being of African American and Latino men, and to address institutional racism in public health departments and systems and pursue health equity. Dr. Griffith is a contributor to and editor of 2 recent books, Men's Health Equity, a Handbook, and Racism, Science and Tools for the Public Health Professional. So I know you join me in welcoming our panelists today. To kick us off, Dr. Maseru is going to provide an overview of the proceedings of the Racism, the Ultimate Underlying Condition webinar presented by the American Public Health Association just last week. Noble.
All right, thanks a lot, Paula. And so on June 9, the first in the webinar series, Advancing Racial Equity, that first is racism, the ultimate underlying condition. And so there are 2 areas that they provide us with a challenge on. One is identify, or we should be thinking about, actionable strategies that we can undertake to be anti-racist and advance racial equity. And secondly, how racism is operating in the areas requiring intervention, and again, organizing and strategizing to act. I emphasize strategizing to act. And in that, realm, some of us may recall Marcus Garvey, and his watchwords was organize, organize, organize. And so Dr. Jones, Kamara Jones, who is on our screen, was the first presenter. Kamara was the past president of APHA in 2016. However, in 2001, Kamara was the representative to Durban, South Africa, in the United Nations conference on eliminating racism. Unfortunately, the Reagan administration recalled Kamara, and she was not able to participate in that meeting. So we've come a long way since 2001. So during Kamara's tenure as president of APHA, what she did is that she more or less called a call to action for APHA to identify racism structures. And she did that by using two allegories. One many of you are familiar with, called the Gardener's Tale, and a second one which involves a restaurant. And the restaurant allegory is presented where Kamara is dining in the restaurant, and there's a sign that she sees, and she sees the sign in her direction that says open. However, those on the outside, what they see is a sign that is closed. And so what she realizes that there is a dual reality. And so one of these, what she decided to do is launch this campaign, this national campaign during her tenure against racism. And she more or less stated that there were three areas that needed to, from which we needed to act to address racism. One is to articulate it, meaning identify or at least say it, racism. And then secondly, determine how racism is operating wherever we are at. And then thirdly, organizing strategies to act. And so inside the restaurant, she realized that it's difficult if you're inside the restaurant to recognize inequity, because we're sitting inside, those who are sitting inside the restaurant are sitting in a position of privilege. But those on the outside are very aware of the two-sided nature of the sign because it's closed off to them. And so racism in that allegory to her is not just a sign, it's also the door, it's the lock. It's all things that more or less are strong, that acts as a barrier that excludes. And so what we must do is to come up with an opposition, first naming racism, and then dismantling the system, and then identifying interventions as to how we're going to do that. So when Kamara is talking about racism, she's talking about the system, all right? She's talking about the system and the system of power, a system that manifests itself in a disproportionate impact as is expressed in COVID-19, the pandemic, on Black and Brown and Indigenous people. For those in reproductive health and trying to strive for birth equity, it's in areas such as infant mortality. So it's the structures of opportunity that also assigns value. And so Kamara completes her introductory remarks by talking about that racism operates historically, and it also operates on a day-to-day with those impacts that I mentioned. It unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities. The second presenter, Dr. Allen, is a professor in community health sciences at University of California. And,
Noble, should we advance the slides? I'm sorry.
yeah, my mistake. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Dr. Amani's expertise in her area, she focuses on race and socioeconomic health disparities and the measurement and the study of racism as a social determinant. She talks about the physiological impacts of racism and toxic stress on health and health disparities. She also talks about, say, racism. She does conceptualize racism as a stressor. And as a result, she focuses on how stress is a primary mechanism by which racism gets into the body. And so she talks about something called the allostatic load. And if you could share that next slide, please. Yeah. And so she expresses that the allostatic load wears and tears on the body from repetitive experiences of stress. And we think of this as chronic stress. African Americans report chronic stress, this experience through racial discrimination over their lifetime. And I should say our lifetime. And many repeat or are saying that this occurs daily. And so she's looking at, she looks at something called allostatic load measures a variety of different biomarkers that indicate functioning across multiple bodily systems, such as the cardiovascular, neuroendocrine, metabolic, and immune systems. And so allostatic load then is a measure of multi-systems, physiologic dysregulation, or what we usually know, or many of you are familiar with, is called weathering. And so the point here that she makes is that there is evidence that racial discrimination does matter and it can be harmful to one's health. And so she talks about another measure of physiologic dysregulation, and that's what we're seeing on the screen, and that is telomere lengthening. And telomeres are the repeated sequences of non-coding DNA that cap the ends of chromosomes, thereby preserving the integrity of the cells. And what she provides is evidence of a number of studies that have demonstrated a link between stress and telomere degradation. So there is a consensus, as she says, in the literature over time that African Americans lose telomeres at a faster pace, implicating something environmental is the cause of these disparities. And so she confirms this hypothesis through several studies that have shown that social determinants, the social context in which we are born, persons of African descent, in which we live, grow, and age, play a critical role in shorter telomeres among African Americans. And so what we're seeing at the right of the screen is that we're seeing that the lengthening has a greater, or the wearing the length has a greater impact, telomere length has a greater impact among African Americans than among whites. One particular study shows that having a high school diploma has a significantly greater impact in influencing the length of telomeres. And for many of you, some of y'all may know that we conducted a study here at Pitt Public Health around life expectancy, and what we discovered in our work is that the Brookings Institute also identified a high school diploma can add 10 years on one's life expectancy, just the acquisition of a high school diploma. So now Dr. Allen's work is showing the effect and influence of telomeres in terms of the chromosomes, the subatomic, if you will, where what's taking on biologically. And so lastly, she also found that there is a link between racial discrimination in both hypertension and telomere length among African American men, with the greatest impact among those with an anti-Black bias, or what we may call, and Dr. Jones in A Gardener's Tale talks about as internalized racism. On the other hand, having a pro-Black bias or a positive sense of racial identity is protective. So lots of things are going on in thinking about biology of racial discrimination. And so as I mentioned earlier on in terms of Marcus Garvey, in bringing forth a positive self-determination and spiritual presence in terms of Black identity, little did he know in the 40s and the 30s that the pro-Black and proud presentation actually was a protective in terms of the biologic, in terms of telomere length. So with that said, I will more or less close, and with the three principles that Dr. Jones talked about, at least what she wanted to emphasize in her talk, these three principles of achieving health equity, that first, you must identify racism. You must acknowledge and recognize the historical injustices. And thirdly, provide new resources according to need, and come up with an intervention. So the importance of understanding the structural racism and institutional racism is the level of which what she believes we must act if we're going to make a change. And the next slide, please. And so Dr. Jones provides us with this framework. And this framework she established during her tenure as the APHA president around these 8 collective action items. And so rather than going into detail about these 4 frameworks in terms of, 8 collective action teams addressing education, communication, and science, is that her bottom line on this is that policies is to, if we're going to make a change in terms of structure, is that we must first of all identify and determine who's at the table and who's not at the table, who should be at the table, and also address mechanisms in which these structures, policies, practices, norms, and values must be changed. And so it is our job to not just represent the interests of that particular institution that we're working at, but it's our job also to, guess what, as she says, create space for others to be at the table. And so this is what what she concludes, is that we must expand our table, not only identify racism, how it's operating in our environment, but we need to organize and strategize and move forward to address to develop the science and practice of anti-racism, identify what those value targets are, and what she calls as societal. She calls those as societal barriers to achieving equity. And one of those societal barriers is white supremacy. She says that is the core. That is the core to the 7 barriers that she identified. It's white supremacy, the myth of American exceptionalism, limited future orientation, thinking of things in terms of competition over cooperation, the myth of meritocracy, thinking in an ahistorical perspective, and then lastly, focusing on the individual. So finally, her message is collective action, that only through power, through collective action, will we realize to have change outside of the restaurant. Remember, one of her allegories is she's inside the restaurant. So she realized that there was a flaw in that allegory, and that is that those outside, that we must lock arms with those outside. And so the call to collective action is power. And that power is to connect with those individuals who are marginalized. And so that's it, Paula. That's the more or less the summary of the 2 presenters.
Thank you very much, Noble, for that wonderful overview. I think that definitely gives us a wonderful framework from which to move forward today. We would now like to give each of our panelists an opportunity to provide an opening remark. Dr. Griffith has not joined us yet, but he will provide his when he signs on. So let's start with Liv.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today, and thank you, Pitt, for having me. I'm Liv Bennett. As I was introduced, I'm the County Councilor for District 13. I've come to this work just because of life experience and my experience here in Pittsburgh. I've been seeing reports come out of University of Pittsburgh since I was in high school talking about the racism in our region. I went to a predominantly white high school, Oakland Catholic, which these religious institutions have issues with racism all of their own. At Carlo, I was working in regards to racism, diversity, and inclusion. I sat on the Diversity and Inclusion Council at Carlo while I was there, and was asked to rejoin recently as an alum. So that is all part of my work. It's always been a part of my work, and now I'm able to transfer that into my role as a county councilor. We were able to declare racism as a public health crisis on county council, and we're doing a lot of work. And I don't know, like, for me, it connects to racism. Sometimes I have to explain how it connects, but as Dr. Noble explained in his presentation, all of these different intersections, education, policy, communication, all these things are connected, and they all are impacted by racism in our region. So to that end, we're doing a lot of policy around police right now, just because that's where a lot of the energy is at this moment. But yeah, we are looking at all of the things. Fortunately, we had a nice cheat sheet coming out of the University of Pittsburgh with the Gender Equity Report. So we're just doing a lot of that work, seeing how we can do the drilling down in the work that actually needs to be done in regards to these intersections that play out and give Black folks a much lesser outcome in this area. So that's me.
Thank you very much, Liv. Dr. Gilbert.
Good morning to those of you in Central and Western time zones, and good afternoon to you all in the Eastern time zone. And I want to thank the University of Pittsburgh for inviting me virtually back home to talk to you all. So as was mentioned before, I'm an associate professor at St. Louis University. I am also co-director for the Institute for Healing, Justice, and Equity, and also along with Derek Griffith, the co-editor of the Racism Science and Tools for the Public Health Professional text that's been published by APHA Press. Just to give you a quick background into some of the work that I do, I really am interested in the visibility and invisibility of Black health, and in particular of Black men's health across the life course. And what I mean by that is really trying to get an understanding of sort of really the lack of care and concern that we sort of divert, and the energy that we divert to thinking about Black health in general and Black men's health until someone is injured or someone dies. A few years ago, the New York Times had a statistic that said 1.5 million Black men are invisible or missing. And those were Black men between the ages of 25 to 54. 900,000 of those were the result of mortality. About 625,000 of those was the result of incarceration. And when we think about that number, it's a very startling number to think about 1.5 million Black men missing between the ages of 25 and 54. My work really tries to focus on not only understanding the root causes of disparities, but also really thinking about the types of interventions, not just individual level interventions, but group, family, community level interventions, and even systems level interventions that we need to develop to actually address these issues across the life course. And I'll stop there because I know that we want to get into a discussion and some questions and answers.
Thank you very much. We have a first question in our Q&A, and Liv, this question is for you. What changes are you considering on County Council to correct the inequities highlighted by the Gender Equity Report?
Well, we already kind of started that work when we declared racism as a public health crisis on the county level, mimicking the city, because we want to create a city-county table that will start hitting on these issues of inequity in Allegheny County, Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. So recently, after we declared racism as a public health crisis, our next step is to create that table. So the city of Pittsburgh has already begun to create their equity task force. And so what we did at the county was just basically pass a motion saying that we would participate and support the city's equity task force so that we can kind of participate and get the groundwork with the city, get working out those kinks, get some of that groundwork done, and then expand that to the county. And then, of course, some of that work, the other reason the county is at this table is because some of that work is going to require county resources like the county health department. So we want to make sure that we are working together and collaboratively, which I believe Dr. Noble talked about in his presentation. So we want to just make sure that we're working collaboratively throughout this region to bring about solutions and to start knocking back some of the inequities that are in our region.
And so, Paula, I would also like to add that Commissioner Bennett, in terms of the life expectancy work that we did, she mentioned the Gender Equity Commission. Well, the life expectancy range was 62 years of age for some selected neighborhoods. The 63 neighborhoods that we looked at was 62 to 84. So there's a 22-year differential in those neighborhoods. In Highland Park and Larimer, Highland Park had the 84 years and Larimer 62, and they're contiguous. So they're right next to one another. So to Commissioner Bennett's observation in terms of addressing equity or inequities, we have to determine what is it about what's going on in Larimer and other neighborhoods that have this low differentiation in terms of life expectancy, which is a measure by the World Health Organization for Human Development.
Thank you, Noble. Thank you for those comments. A question that comes to my mind is, you know, when we're looking at that root cause of racism, how do we move beyond the transactional of, you know, creating a task force? You know, how do we move beyond those nuts and bolts sort of things we must do to confront the racism and the white supremacy that is at the root of the issues that we are dealing with today? How do we open those conversations, not only on county council, but city council and you know, city and nationwide, so that we have a fighting chance of addressing some of these issues?
Well, I know for me, I wear multiple hats. So while I am a county councilor, I'm also a part of the Black Activists Collective. So we have really been talking to folks about, especially our white allies, co-accomplices, about having conversations with each other, with themselves, with their own people, around racism, and not having Black folks do that labor. Since we've gotten so much more participation in this last, I guess, you know, since George Floyd, since the larger community has been more activated than I've ever seen in my lifetime, we felt like this is a great time to shift that responsibility back to where it belongs with white folks, and having those conversations. Like, it's easy to come out in the street to wag your finger at somebody in Minnesota, but you haven't checked the racists at your dinner table. So that's the work that we're asking our white conspirators to do, because that is the work that matters. While we can make policy and have discussions till the sky comes home, we can't really govern individual behavior, and that's where the responsibility is. It's individual behavior and ideologies that need to shift. And that comes through conversation, and conversation with folks that have relationship with these folks, which by and large are not Black people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, thank you. Keon, would you like to weigh in as well?
Yes, I can add a few things. So what's interesting about this moment, as Liv has mentioned, is that there's been sort of this awakening in terms of everyone paying attention or noticing or identifying with this idea of systemic racism. And for a lot of people, it's new. For those of us who have been in this space and have lived as Black, you know, this is also not new to us. One of the things that's really interesting, and I've been reflecting on this over the last few weeks, is that I remember as an undergrad and even in grad school, going to conferences and meetings, and the experts and the leaders on panels saying, we've been having this conversation for 20 years. And so what I fear certainly is that in 20 years, we'll be having this conversation again without actually addressing the issues. And so the charge, or the concern that I have, is that we not only sort of pay lip service to this idea of trying to understand and think about systemic racism, but also really think about what are the structural changes that have to happen, what are the changes that have to happen in our interpersonal interactions with one another and behaviors, and also really just thinking about what are the really important action steps that can be developed and really sort of put into motion as a way of addressing systemic racism.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pause for just a moment and give Dr. Griffith an opportunity to say hello and greet our attendees. And also, if you'd like to give an opening statement.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Again, I apologize for my tardiness. I'm jumping from one presentation to this one, so thank you for your indulgence. I mean, I don't know if you already did my introduction and stuff, or should
we read your bio, but please share
gotcha.
anything you would like to.
That's good enough. No, I just, I think, I know one of the things that you want us to talk about was the intersection of race and gender and racism and how it's gendered. And particularly in this moment, I think it's really important to recognize that the expectations, the norms, and the experiences of racism are heavily gendered, that we don't tend to pay enough attention to that. Actually, my initial introduction to this idea of racism was actually from a faculty member who was at Pittsburgh when I was an undergrad, Jerome Taylor, who was in the psychology department there. And he was on sabbatical at University of Maryland when I was an undergrad. And he was the one who mentored me and taught me and sort of opened up the whole world of studying race and racism using psychological research, and that then I've transitioned into public health with. So Pitt is very special to me from that perspective. But yeah, I'm just happy to join in this conversation. But so I'll just stop there. Thanks.
So I'll just mention that in Kamara's talk, she does identify, or at least acknowledge, that there have been events in our past where the society has raised its voice against racism. And she mentions Dr. King's assassination. She mentions the Flint, the poisoning of the Flint water. People clamored against racism. And so she uses a term that's called somnolence, 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 and that we should not allow society to revert back, that we should not go to sleep on this, and that we should engage very vehemently in naming racism and then identifying where racism exists in our presence. How is it operating here? That's what she's saying.
Absolutely. So we have a question for Dr. Gilbert. Considering Dr. Jones's anti-racism framework, are there tools that we can begin to apply in our institutions?
Yeah, so one of the things I can point to, I'm working on a project here in St. Louis University. I'm a co-investigator on a project funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to look at the ways that government agencies are addressing racial equity in their work. So there are a range of, for example, racial equity tools from a number of organizations such as Gare and PolicyLink that really help people, whether there's community-based institutions or government institutions, to try to understand how the work that they're doing is contributing to systemic racism. And so some part of that work really helps organizations or institutions to sort of undo racism, as well as sort of do an analysis of sort of what's happening in their day-to-day interactions, also what's happening between the institutions and the communities that they're intending to serve. How might those practices and policies sort of contribute to systemic racism in a number of different ways. And so it's really important, as Liv mentioned, for institutions and even individuals to do that really important work of thinking about where are you contributing? What's your role? And as people use those tools, sometimes that means that they may look at certain data. And I think that's happening across the country with a number of corporations that are doing these listening sessions with their employees about racist practices and policies, but also not only just listening to people, but then developing those really important action steps to be able to say, here are areas where we can fix now and areas that we can fix later. So there are a number of tools that you can look at that have been developed by a number of reputable institutions across the country.
Yeah, I don't think we should understate what Dr. Gilbert just stated. I mean, we need to measure it and put measures on racism.
Can I add something?
Absolutely.
So I would say for Pittsburgh specifically, Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, since we are notably the worst place for Black women to live. What I've noticed and what we've noticed as a collective is that institutions, especially these nonprofits, are often out here doing work for Black communities, and are using Black bodies. Their frontline employees are Black. However, if you dig down into actually who is leading that organization, it's somebody white. And that person may not even be, I know we're having a issue with a particular organization where they posted something very, their lead the co-founder of the organization posted something very racist. And so that's what we need to call those things out, because how do we continue or how do we move beyond being the worst place for Black women to live if we continue doing the same things and expect different results?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dr. Griffith, did you want to weigh in on that as well?
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I think both were wonderful points, all three actually, but one of my favorite books is called Know Thyself, that Naeem Akbar wrote probably 20 years ago. And it has this three-part way of thinking about how you can, that you have to unlearn certain things, you have to sort of relearn different things, and you have to come up with new strategies for how you're going to address whatever the issues are. So I'm just adapting without getting into the specifics of it. But I think this very much speaks to how do we need to deal with racism, is that it takes some thought and some effort to really unlearn and identify what are the things that you need to really unlearn, whether it's internalized racism that you've internalized about yourself, whether it's internalized privilege that you realize that you have unearned privilege that you need to kind of figure out what to do with, if you will. And then how to think about new ways of learning where you can get more accurate information or make sure that the assumptions that you're working from are actually in fact true. And then what are some strategies that can concretely move the agenda forward so that you're not doing what Dr. Gilbert said, which is us having the same conversation in 20 years and lamenting why we haven't moved in that time frame.
I want to say amen. So thank you. Absolutely.
And I know Kendi talks about being anti-racist, and one measure several determinants, but one measure of whether or not racism exists is happening here is the outcomes. If those outcomes are still disadvantaging certain populations and advantaging others in a manner that's inequitable, then racism exists. So yeah, building on Dr. Griffith's point and Gilbert's in terms of measurement.
Absolutely. Another question that has been posed, for those of us leading training programs in public health, how do you envision efforts we can start to have an improved pipeline for enrolling underrepresented minority trainees, particularly Black students in training for public health?
Derek, do you want to start? It's also very funny to hear Derek call me Dr. Gilbert. Derek is one of my mentors and friends and big brothers. So, anyway. It's interesting, like Liv, I've been on diversity committees since I was in college. And so there's sort of this myth that Black students, Latino students, students from communities of color just aren't interested in college. They can't find them. Sort of goes throughout every institution, every discipline that we can think of. We can't find them. We can't find them. There was a point, I believe, in our history where there were a lot of pipeline programs that existed in communities that prepared students for STEM programs, for arts programs, and those were sort of viewed as kind of primary training opportunities to encourage students to think about those types of disciplines, those types of areas of study. And then I don't know what happened to those programs in various communities. And I don't know what happened in terms of higher ed institutions developing or supporting them in a number of ways. I mean, there are still programs like McNair and Upward Bound and other versions of those that exist, but certainly they don't exist in all places, and they're not funded in the ways that they probably should be. And so also, even when we think about public health, there used to be a number of training programs. Bill Jenkins used to run one out of CDC a number of years ago. And so those things just kind of sort of went away for a range of reasons that we can sort of, we can spend some time on that, but it's probably not worth it. But part of sort of what I think a lot of us have been talking about, not only here, but in other places, is really what are the commitments that people are willing to make. And so a number of higher ed institutions have made commitments saying that they, sort of repudiate the death of George Floyd. They're just, astonished. They want to commit to being anti-racist. They want to address systemic racism. But yet we have not seen those changes in admissions practices yet. We've not seen those changes in the ways that we support students of color once they enter into institutions of higher education, and ensuring that they persist through, and also not supporting them in the same kinds of ways in terms of supporting them in their career goals. And so there's a lot of different leverage points that we can point to, not only in higher ed, but even when we think about other places, whether it's in corporations and nonprofits as well. I'll stop. I can say so much more.
I would also add that part of white supremacy is just picking the same Black person to be the face constantly. And I see that in institutions, also carried over into state and city, state, and county government. But I think that there are enough feeding points for these universities. Like, I know when I was at Carlo, I was often the one that was picked to do, oh, will you be on our literature? Will you be on our website? Oh, will you be on the diversity? And I have a big mouth, so that might be part of it. But the other part is that they just were too lazy to go look for other qualified Black folks to do these things. And so they get comfortable. And if you continue to allow them to do that, they will just continue to use the same person and never rise up or look for other candidates to fill these roles.
Yeah, the only thing I would just add is, I think for programs, you have to look at what you're using as inclusion criteria. There've been a lot of, it was interesting. I think it was Harvard that recently, just for this year, suspended use of SAT as part of their inclusion, their admissions criteria. I mean, we know standardized tests have been problematic as part of the, and one of the gates, and one of the gates that have been largely locked to certain populations for a long time, that's one of the ways that people are kept out, because we may not perform as well on these standardized tests, but it's not really a good marker of our success, our efforts, or our intelligence. So I think it's looking at what are the criteria that you're using, where are you looking for students? I without getting myself in too much trouble, which I tend to do, there was a recent comment, I'm gonna disguise this as best I can, but I don't know how good I'm gonna be at this, that there's this constant trope of, well, we can't find them, and so we don't need to, we just kind of throw our hands up as an institution, like, well, we tried looking for folks in this area, we can't see professionals who do that, so okay, we're just gonna stop because we just don't know where else to look. And I'm like, well, why don't you actually talk to the people that, who actually represent that group and work with them, or you have to make more active efforts to engage folks in those communities and build more of those pipelines. They're not just gonna necessarily show up at your door, because your door hasn't been open or welcoming in a lot of those times and places. So why am I gonna show up at your door if you're not even likely to even open it for me? So I think there are a lot of those kinds of efforts that we need to pay attention to, consider it when we think about these kind of issues.
As a longtime admissions person, I would also submit that it harkens back to the thought of transactional and a transactional approach versus a relational approach. And people of color tend to be relationship driven. We are networkers. We know each other. We want to be invited in. We invite others in. If it's just a matter of, I sent you an email and you didn't respond, and that's so in someone's mind, that transaction didn't yield any fruit. And so as far as they're concerned, that's a wrap, and they're walking away, when that's not at all how we approach ways that we connect with organizations and other people.
And we posted it on our website, so other folks found it, so why couldn't they? Sorry.
Yeah.
No. Well, back to this idea of measurement. One of the ways that institutions measure their worth, their value is, and some of the things that Derek mentioned in terms of SAT scores, ACT scores. And so that helps universities move up in the rankings. And so we could apply this idea to not only higher ed institutions, but other places in terms of we're able to recruit the best, or we're able to recruit the smartest. And so then when we think about that as a measurement goal or as an outcome, then you see why on the front end, you have these types of inclusion and exclusion criteria. And so removing those barriers also then means you have to change this other outcome of thinking about how might an institution be viewed as an institution that's elite or the place to go. And so we can change them on both ends. And I think that's the challenge that people are having, of trying to figure out, how do I balance both sides of this equation in a way that allows us to, maintain the rigor or the quality of the educational experience while still recruiting, quote unquote, the best. And part of that gets to this idea of training programs. I mean, we have incredible fractures within our education systems. And so, those of us who've worked in higher ed know that all students that come to us are not equal. They've not been educated in the same ways. And so we spend the time, whether we want to call it remediation or other types of things, we do spend the time helping to prepare students to rise to the level. And so those types of programs are really important. We see programs that help to orient international students. We can do the same kinds of things for students that come from low resource and communities of color. I'll stop again, I could go on.
So I just want to mention the institutional intervention. So Kamara is talking about identifying racism, how it exists, where it exists, calling it out, but also now what do we need to do to change it, and expanding the table. And so Dr. Gilbert mentioned the Upward Bound program, and Paula and I have talked about the Upward Bound program, and let's figure out how to get that resuscitated and be present here at University of Pittsburgh. But additionally, that's an institutional structural kind of change there, policy-wise. But additionally, in terms of the National Institutes of Health diversity supplements, now that's a mechanism that's available, and it also is available from at high school all the way through postdoc. So that's another area that we're working on in establishing an institutional response here at Pitt Public Health. And then lastly, I'll mention in terms of, again, expanding the table and having others present. One other approach that we've put together is an MOU with Jackson State University, a historically Black institution that is the only school of public health so we would have a faculty as well as a student exchange, and also in terms of research in those areas. So that's an institutional response that addresses the racism and exclusion that we know that exists within Pitt, but also outside of Pitt. And certainly Jackson, Mississippi would be the epicenter of some of the racist assaults on our population. So that collaboration is going to advance our effort in achieving equity and social justice.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Noble.
absolutely. I was involved in Investing Now, which was also at the University of Pittsburgh. And it was actually like part medical explorer. So that was definitely a exciting and a great time for the university to engage students. I think I was in middle school, high school, I don't remember, one of those. It was a long time ago, y'all, but yeah, so that, like, we actually went to the medical building. We had workshops, we got to see cadavers, so was a excellent program, and it was geared towards African American students, and so yes, revitalizing those types of programs would definitely help to reignite interest and participation in public health from African Americans in the community.
Yeah. We also have to acknowledge the loss of funding through the HCOP program on the federal level, and it started draining away in the late 90s, and now, you know, calls for proposals are rare, and they're largely funding centers, and so those, you know, we actually used to have a PHCOP in public health years ago. So there are definitely some resources that are not there anymore. So we just have to be, I think, creative in sourcing others.
It's interesting that you bring that up, Paula, because Dr. Jones, Kamara Jones, actually gave testimony to the House yesterday. And one of the areas that she talked about was something that Dr. Gilbert mentioned about the MHOTEP program. Dr. Jenkins established. It still exists. So those pipeline programs, in her comments around COVID-19 and the impact that it's having on Black and Brown communities, she mentioned the federally qualified health centers, and I know Dr. Gary Webb and Commissioner Bennett is working on a project with the Black Coalition with the federally qualified health centers around training and development of folks around contact tracing. So that's another pipeline for development and training.
But I would also like to say that I would love for institutions, especially universities, to reach outside of their sphere or their own communities. I know when my daughter was at University Prep had a partnership with the University of Pittsburgh, so it forced participation, but that partnership somehow dissolved. So I think it is a great, it's great for universities to come out into these communities, especially partnering with these secondary schools, high schools, to kind of to get that pipeline going. So stop working in these silos. I had the same critique for Carlo. Carlo sits right outside the Hill District. Why are we not, you know, giving resources or figuring out how we can partner with these communities to bring in some of these people, the talent, the resources, which are the people. So that would be my thing, is just getting more creative and getting out of the bubble of the University of Pittsburgh or the University of whatever, Carlo, whoever, and really start being intentional on going out to these schools. Because I'm telling you, I work a lot with PPS. They would love some partnerships. They would definitely love partnerships and some investment to be able to give their students even more resources than they're providing now.
Absolutely, thank you. All right, a question. This one's meaty. How do we bridge the urban-suburban divide? And our questioner notes, I saw this very clearly during Lisa Middleman's campaign as a poll watcher at the southern end of the county. The most common comment I heard was, "He has been doing a fine job, no reason to change." I see this at the Pennsylvania state level. I saw it in New Jersey between Newark and the executive bedroom communities less than 5 miles away. How do we bring the urgency of addressing racism to the suburbs? Even as a white person who lived in those areas and tried to raise awareness, I have not found a way to move forward. So that's a pretty meaty question? How do we bridge that divide?
I don't know, because I think it goes back to Dr. Noble when he was talking. Can't remember which doctor or which presenter it was that gave the restaurant illustration. And if you're inside the restaurant, then you don't realize that you have privileges that aren't afforded to the people outside the restaurant. So I don't know how to solve that other than for them to step outside of their comfort and their privilege and to learn about the discomfort and the non-privilege of folks that don't look like them. I think that the onus is on people to do the work and not be, I think we're in a society where people expect to be spoon-fed everything, and we have lost critical thinking and the ability to go out and do our own research, and we want to be given everything instead of forming our own opinions and getting our own education and our own and enlightening our experiences. So the only answer I have is to get out there and do the work. Google's free. There's countless books. I can name about 5 of them right now. Got a whole pile sitting out there. I can bring them in and show them, put them in front of the camera. I mean, part of this is you're going to have to do your work.
I guess my response would be, just echoing what you're saying, that I would start with the people. We tend to, when we do this work, start with the most difficult, and we tend to want to actually go to the folks who are the most resistant to what you're actually trying to say. And what I would actually start with is start with the people who seem to be the most interested or the most open to this. Build your networks, do this sort of snowballing of people who actually seem to be at least open to hearing and communicating and building relationships with folks who are genuinely interested in bridging the divide that you're talking about. But start having those conversations, start building those relationships, start talking to people and getting to know them and figuring out sort of what they're actually interested in. But just going to the most difficult and most resistant is probably going to feel like you're beating your head against a wall, versus if you build through strength versus always sort of fighting against the most difficult, you tend to be a lot more, successful. So this is kind of more of just a version of an organizing strategy, but you kind of want to build, from a position where you're actually building from people who are actually genuinely interested, and go to the people who are more difficult. But you want to build from having a positive coalition versus starting with those that are more difficult.
And I think that leads me to one of our next question. We're talking about, the consideration of, connecting with allies, and whether folks are accomplices or whether they are co-conspirators. And the question is, many of us are hearing new terms during these times. Liv used the term co-accomplice. Could you please define that term in this context?
So as we said earlier, there's been a rising up in this after George Floyd that a lot of us have not seen in our lifetimes. I mean, I wasn't here when Dr. King was assassinated. I'm not that old. So no shade, but so I have not seen this level of engagement from such a coalition of people that were non-Black people. So when we talk about co-accomplices and co-conspirators, we've seen groups rise up. We've seen groups that just formed. I saw one on Facebook the other day that just happened to come across my timeline of white folks who have built this coalition of within each other, who are basically saying, if you Black people get into a situation with a white person who is being racist and they don't understand their racism, tag us in. Let us check them. Don't do that work. That is hard work for y'all. Y'all been doing this emotional labor for years. It's time for us to pick it up. So that's exactly what I mean by co-conspirators, are white accomplices that are willing to step in and do the work, have those conversations, check folks, and take that responsibility away from Black folks who have been doing this labor for centuries.
And I always think of it as an ally as somebody who will, they'll speak up for you. An accomplice is someone who will join you, you know, once you've started the work, but the co-conspirator is the one who's behind the scenes with you actually planning the action. And that's how I think of that continuum in my head. And I
Yeah,
think, Keon, you
it
were going
doesn't
to say
quite work the same in organizing because we don't bring white folks to the organizing table. But yeah, in organizing, it works kind of what I said is that, you know, you're just sending these white folks out to kind of do the exterior work, do their work within their own communities, to have those conversations, because it's triggering for Black people to first experience racism and then have to explain why it's racist. So if we don't have to do all that, if we could just go away from having to explain it and re-traumatize ourselves over and over again, and white folks are now here to pick up that burden for us, thank you. And that's exactly what we've been asking for, and have given you the due name of co-conspirators.
And just to add a book that for Commissioner Bennett, I know it's on her shelf someplace, and that's Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. So that would be one that they should pick up. There it is. All right, stamp from
the
the
beginning.
beginning. That preceded it. That
Yeah,
started it all.
This is also a Kendi book, so this is probably where you should start, even though it's like a Bible, but it definitely will give you the history, and that probably goes back to that other question of where to start that work. Started doing work, reading books like this, that'll tell you where the history comes from, because American history will have you believe that Black folks are making all this up. So read a book that'll tell you exactly why and where we have got, where racism has started and where we are today, which this book is about 600 pages. So it goes to it all.
Yeah. Read that book, not just a book, read that book.
Yes.
All right, the next question in our Q&A, how do we as predominantly white faculty start the conversation in a way that is productive and creates allies instead of breeding resentment?
Well, speaking of books, I would pick up the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, which will give you some really good kind of framework in how to do that work, because that's exactly the work that the author of that book did, and she's a white woman. So I think that would be a good starting place for folks who want to try to start tackling that.
Yeah, I'd also recommend Silent Racism by Barbara Trappinger. It's a bit older, but it was something that she wrote. She did basically focus groups with white women who said they weren't racist, about their racist attitudes and how did they come out and how did they manifest themselves in the context of that conversation. So it's a useful place to see how these things play out in more subtle ways than what you may be sort of, you may be looking for things that are going to be much more extreme, overt, and in your face, but what these combination of books will help you sort of realize is there's a subtlety to it that often can be more pernicious and more impactful and more hurtful than some of the even more overt things that we actually see.
Thank you. Okay, next question. How do we avoid putting the trauma on Black students to do the work to dismantle racism? Oftentimes administration asks students, this is harkening back to your experiences, Liv, oftentimes administration asks students, how do we address this issue when it should be coming from higher officials?
That's a difficult one because you gotta realize that most likely the reason they're asking you is because they don't want to do the work for themselves. So if you don't help them, if you don't provide them some framework, then what'll happen? Will they actually gain an understanding? But on the same token, we go back to the fact that this is often traumatic and triggering for Black folks to continuously have to explain racism to people. So for me, I've gone to, for me, I'm kind of extreme, so you might not want to take my example, but I've stopped talking to white people actually. So Like, I'm just done. So I'll suggest some books for you, but I'm not going to continue doing this labor that I've been doing for years and years and years, because when I was telling it to you, you obviously weren't listening, and now you want me to come back and read and exert all this mental energy. So even when Carlo asked me to rejoin the Diversity and Inclusion Council, I was very direct with them, like, so are we going to get anything done, or are we just going to sit here and have meetings? Because if we're going to sit here and have meetings, I'm not for it. You can skip this invitation and keep it moving. If y'all really are trying to get some stuff done, I'm for it. But and I think it goes to also knowing what the outcome is going to be too, because a lot of times we're asked to sit at these tables that really aren't ever designed to do anything. It's just to continue having these conversations, building these task force or whatever else you want to call them, just to sit there and continue to have these conversations. We've had studies that date back to at least 1969 that basically say the same thing that came out in 2019. We're done with studies, we're done with task force, let's get to solutions. And what does that look like? So for me, if you're not talking about a table that is working towards solutions, and you're just talking about a table to have in conversations, you can miss me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's an author, Sarah Ahmed, who talks about non-performatives, and those are those committees, those initiatives that really aren't designed to do anything. It exists because it needs to exist, but it really doesn't exist for any particular outcome. And there are a lot of non-performatives around.
Yeah, so I think for me, I would discourage you from putting the work on students. Students are going to naturally take up this kind of work because they're genuinely going to be interested in it. But I think the better statement is, what are you doing so that the students don't have to do the work or don't have to do as much of the work? So there are models out there. There are lots of organizations that do all kinds of training. You have an expert in your midst, Michael Jonas, who's, I don't know where, I can't see on the screen, but I know he's there with, he has his Pittsburgh Foundation, who's been doing this work for a long time. So shout out, Mike. But there are all these other folks who've been doing this kind of work. There are various organizations that are anti-racist training organizations, People's Institute, I mean, on and on and on. It's not something, you're not at a point where there aren't models out there. You're not at a point where you can't talk to other colleagues or frankly look to other faculty who are doing this work and ask what should be done. So, I mean, Keon has a whole institute at his institution that's doing this work. I mean, so they need to the faculty need to look to other faculty or to other places, not put that burden on students to basically do the work for them that they should have been doing themselves. So if you're serious about it, you'll figure out how to get with colleagues who are not at your institution or in the community who can help you do this kind of work. A lot of it has to do with the curriculum. A lot of it has to do with what you're teaching, with the assumptions that you're making, with the examples that you give in the classroom. I mean, there's a lot of work that can be done. I mean, I know Mario, is, again, just the range and wealth of expertise you all have at that institution and just in the Pittsburgh area, I know it's just a goldmine of folks. So, and the people that have passed through there, I know various people, again, I won't keep dropping names, but it's I just think important for you to recognize that it's not the work of the students. They're supposed to be there to learn. They have a job to do. It should be your work to work on your institution if you are invested in your institution.
I think that's an excellent point, and many of the things I was going to say. There's been a lot of backlash from student groups who have read their department, college, and university statements and have said this very thing, that it's not our job to teach you and to prepare you of how to create an anti-racist institution or prepare a curriculum or education program that doesn't demean and degrade their lived experiences. It's their job and their work, and it should be their work. And we should definitely find ways to protect students as much as possible or engage them in appropriate ways.
And I'll also just always go back to accountability, that we identified targets. So Commissioner Bennett and what Dr. Gilbert has talked about in terms of our goals and objectives, what are the measurements for achieving equity? And that's what Drs. Allen and Jones stated in terms of identifying targets and meeting those targets. If we don't meet those targets and we still remain on those committees, then we're complicit. We're token. It's tokenism, and I think Dr. Gilbert articulated something called lip service. So no, we're not in the business for lip service. We're gonna, if folks are at the table to address and eradicate and eliminate racism, then we're going to provide metrics in terms of achieving our goal to have social justice. And so accountability, transparency, and metrics.
I also think that there needs to be a place where we're talking about the education too, though, because I know that the University of Pittsburgh undergrad, a recent graduate, started a petition to have African American history as part of the core curriculum at the university. So, I mean, I know in my curriculum when I was at a university, I had to take, you know, women's studies, I had to take an art. Now, no time did I have to take an African American studies course. So if this is not a part of your main history, then you will have to weigh heavily on minority students or Black students in particular, because they're the only ones that know the history. So if you broaden the history and the education around Black studies, then you would have a broader span of people that have to do this work.
Mm-hmm.
So since Dr. Massera mentioned tokenism, I wanted to kind of raise, since one of the things I know was on the list to talk about was gender. So there's one of my favorite books is called No More Invisible Man by Adia Wingfield. And what she's talking about is she did focus interviews actually with Black men, I think in corporate America, about sort of their experiences and how they had to basically modulate sort of how they interacted with people, how they spoke, how they, their physical sort of presence. You can't raise your voice, you can't sort of get too close, you can't. So what she introduced for me was a term called partial tokenism, where men are advantaged by their maleness in that environment, but then disadvantaged by their race. And you have to look at the intersection of how you are dealing with that and that combination and the stress. It's kind of a version of what David Williams and others have called vigilance, where you're having to put so much energy into performing different, just the performance of living in that environment. And they've different folks have done work with that on students and so forth, where it's really important to understand that there's this dance that you're doing and how physically exhausting and draining, and it's a different form of what Arlene Geronimus was calling weathering, that it's sort of the same process of doing all this extra work to simply survive in that environment. And it sort of maps onto faculty, students, and so forth. But I wanted to introduce that because she talks about the work being very different for Black women versus Black men, but it's equally sort of damning and stressful and wearing on the body.
Mm-hmm. Outstanding point.
The next question, what about appointing an anti-racism ombudsperson at GSPH, at Pitt Public Health, within each of the schools at Pitt, even for a transitional period, to be a resource and a point person to help us become more skillful, adept, and aware in pointing out and undoing racist thinking, behaviors, practices in ourselves and in others? Is this one way to not overburden our Black colleagues with this work, yet acknowledge that we need help in this process?
So I think it's, so I'm going to say two things that may seem a little contradictory. My first response is, well, actually, let me not say the contradictory part. The first part is, I think the problem is most of the time when we put people in those roles, they don't have any power to do anything. So it doesn't really make a difference, because even if they see things, they don't have any power to there's no carrot and there's no stick to basically be able to get people to make changes. And so usually those positions don't really do anything, and they're tenuous. If you make it sort of a time limited thing, then people are just more likely to just sort of wait you out. And they know that you're not going to be in that role for very long. They know that, they will last longer than that position does. And if you put somebody in there who's not a stable force within that institution and trusted within that institution and is able to be there long term, they have to protect themselves. And so they can't do things that put themselves at risk, because they won't be able to keep their jobs either. So a lot of times you'll put more junior faculty or new associate professors into those roles that are just trying to get their footing in those spaces too. You need somebody who's actually senior, who's actually respected, and who actually has some power to do those kinds of things. If that kind of role is going to make sense. So with all of those ifs and all of those conditions, yeah, you could do something like that, but there are a lot of ifs that most institutions are not willing to, basically, give all of those conditions and that level of power to somebody in that kind of role to lead that kind of change.
So Dr. Griffin, we're going to be bold and say when and not if.
All right.
Other comments on that question?
Yep.
I think
Just
is
go
right.
ahead, Dr. Gilbert.
Well, I was going to say, no, Derek is right. It's a challenge that I think, many institutions have struggled with. And do you need someone in every college or school, or should it be a high level university official? And, the main point is if that person cannot make decisions or have the authority to do that kind of work, then, it's another form of tokenism in a lot of ways. So, it's really important that person has decision-making power, and also that person or that office is accountable, and people, not only the person, but the institution is accountable for enacting the decisions that person or that office is trying to move forward, and, not caught up in sort of the bureaucracy of institutions where we like to form more task force or more committees. And so that's where things stop with saying, well, we need to process this more. Our institutions have been racist for a long time. So and they know it. And so this isn't anything new to them. The strategies and the opportunities and the models and the best practices have been out there, as Derek has mentioned, for a very long time. And so it's really now, are you going to take action, or are you just going to continue to sort of pay lip service to it?
And I would also say that, one of the first things you run into is, academic freedom, right? So you're in an institution and that people need to be exposed to this material, that they need to learn it, they need to understand, and they need to be held accountable. Yet senior leadership would say, well, you can't actually make tenured faculty do anything. And so here we are, and here we always will be if that's the attitude. And academic freedom is set up exactly to perpetuate what it always has and always will.
Or the other thing, yeah, great point. I think just to add to that, the only thing is a lot of times they'll say, okay, if you're going to add this to the curriculum, what are you going to take off? And that there has to be this give and take. And so they're not going to want to take off something that they see as more valuable and more important and more generalizable than these things that they see as really just sort of a niche, sort of cherry on top kind of thing, as opposed to, no, this is really the meat of the work. Whether or not you're going to be successful as an individual with this degree from this institution is really going to be about your ability to navigate these spaces and understand these kind of issues in the world that we're moving into and that we live in now. So it's not this sort of less important than program evaluation kind of attitude. No, it really is central to whether or not you're going to be successful. And so we can't keep treating it as though it's sort of an add-on, though it's not really central to the curriculum, but that's often the way it gets treated.
Absolutely does. I had the same experience when I read through Carlo's tenure track document, and there was no mention about equity, inclusion, bringing diversity into the classroom, changing curriculum to, I know I had a business class, I was a business major. We had to watch 9 to 5 by Dolly Parton, and which is, if y'all ever seen the movie, it's a very racist movie. And there's so many movies that have come out since then that can illustrate the same point. So while if we keep talking about and I think that's what I was experiencing at Carlos, that we talk about it in a very lofty, this idea of racism, instead of bringing it down and showing 9 to 5 to a classroom is probably not the most effective way to exercise anti-Black practices, or discriminating against a student because of XYZ is probably not, so bringing those conversations down, not servicing your Black students the same way as you service your white students, like making these things very tangible and connecting, because people have a problem connecting these things if you don't connect them for them. And so back to the university and it not being put into, ingrained into the faculty and being a recommend or a requirement in order for them to be tenured is a definite problem, because if you're not made to do something, you're probably not going to do it.
And to that point, in terms of being made to do something, we in public health are in the position, whereas our accreditation bodies has established that equity is a core value, and that the American Public Health Association has also established social justice and anti-racism as a practice mechanism and a core value. And then the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health, ASPPH, has also established a zero tolerance around xenophobia and racism. And so we do have that advantage now that we can review the curricula and require that this content be in our syllabi.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's the adverse reaction, or what's the consequence if it's not? I think that's where the rubber meets the road. If there's no consequence, then how do you enforce it?
Well, accreditation is certainly a consequence.
True.
Or loss thereof.
But what we're not thinking about is, we're talking about a human family here, just beyond the academic issues. I mean, we're talking about moving this world forward and not necessarily having accreditation or these kind of academic, scholastic box checkoffs as being the reason that we want to link arms and move forward as a global community. I think that's the key right there. That's the focus.
I fully understand that, but I also bring it down because I went to a school that has a nursing school. And so if we're bringing out nurses, and we know one of the areas of inequity is infant mortality and postpartum treatment of women after they have babies. Tangibly, if we're graduating nurses from Carlow University who have racist ideologies, and we're seeing it on Facebook and other places, mm-hmm. then we graduate those folks, and now they're in UPMC as our nurses, then we don't think we're going to see these disparities cross over. So that's why it's very important to connect these educational institutions, because these educational institutions are stockpiling our organizations and hospitals and other institutions that serve us in the greater community.
And that's why you're in that position, Commissioner Bennett, because we're going to hold accountable these health systems. Exactly.
Absolutely.
Oh.
Well, on that note, it is 1:32 and our time has flown. I'd like to thank all of our participants, but above all, thank our panelists. What wonderful, rich conversation. Thank you so much for all that you've poured into all of us today. And it's a good sign when the chat and the Q&A is saying, can you send out these resources? Can you send out these resources? So you've clearly made an impact today. Thank you so much for joining us. Participants, thank you for joining us. We will send out any and all information that we can. Hopefully we're copying the book titles that we were dropping into the chat at the same time. Yes, and you see Dr. Massaro is holding up another one as well. Thank you everyone for coming today. Look forward to more from Pitt Public Health, Health Sciences Diversity, and from the university. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.